Welcome to T is for Trauma. I'm your host, David O'Connor, and today's episode is going to be about sabbaticals. I have been on sabbatical since February of 2022, so when this episode comes out, it'll be a little over 8 months. And if you listened to my episode with Danny Mulvihill, which was episode 7, I think, Danny is also somebody who had taken an extended sabbatical, and we discussed it a little bit, but I wanted to delve into more detail during this episode because it is something that I get a lot of questions about and something that people definitely seem curious about. And I will say that I am not a sabbatical expert. There's definitely a lot of good resources and very comprehensive insights into all of the considerations or things that you can pursue while on sabbatical. But this episode is more about my experience with the sabbatical, why I chose to take one, what are some of the learnings that have come from this time away from my career, and then also how that you can go about structuring your own sabbatical and some of the processes that you can put in place right now to potentially make that happen in the future. If we start with the question of why I decided to take a sabbatical, if you are familiar with my story at all, you'll know that a little bit over 2 years ago, I decided to start MDMA therapy. And in the very first session, I discovered repressed memories of sexual abuse in my childhood. And then over subsequent sessions, it became apparent that this was not a once-off incident. This was actually an extensive pattern of sexual abuse with multiple perpetrators, spanning more than 10 years. And I decided to commit to working through this and continue to do MDMA sessions quarterly. And obviously, as more information came into my consciousness, it had a huge impact on my day-to-day life and mental well-being. On top of this, I was also trying to balance many other different parts of my life, including a very serious relationship and a job that was very demanding and very stressful. Now, while I was focused on learning more about trauma and healing during this time, I was also definitely using these other parts of my life to keep myself busy and distract myself from how terrible and awful this history of abuse was. And if I reflect on that time and I'm being honest, the result was that I wasn't performing particularly well in any of these areas of my life. Really, I was just stretching myself too thinly. And pretty much I ran myself into the ground trying to do too many things at once. And so it became apparent roughly around the middle of last year that the correct thing to do for my healing was not to do more, it was actually to do less. And I started to contemplate the idea of taking a sabbatical to give myself space and time to heal from what had happened in my childhood. If we also think about what was going on in the world around this time, this was summer 2021, and we were just starting to come out the other side of the pandemic, which is obviously something that had taken a huge toll on people's mental health. And I started to become aware of the fact that many of the people that I follow or admire were either on sabbatical or were advocating for the merits of them, having previously taken one. People like Jerry Colonna, Neil Strauss, David Cho, Tim Ferriss, they have all spoken at length about taking time off to focus on yourself. And I think it is also worth pointing out that almost everybody on that list has significant trauma in their past, and they have also spoken about keeping themselves busy to distract themselves from their own personal pain, which again is something that I very much identify with. If we pull the covers back on this idea of keeping yourself busy to distract yourself from your pain, what we're really talking about is workaholism. And I read a quote about a year ago, which I was hoping to track down for this episode, but was unable to. So I'm going to have to paraphrase a little bit. But it went something along the lines of, workaholism is not an addiction to work, it is an addiction to disconnection. And to reference again the episode I did with Danny Mulvihill, we spoke at length during that episode about process addictions, which are not addictions to a substance, they're an addiction to doing a certain thing. So people are very familiar with gambling addiction or sex addiction or food addiction, which are all process addictions. But workaholism is also a process addiction. And during that episode with Danny, I spoke about experiencing almost all of the common process addictions. And workaholism was also on that list. And I don't want to give the impression that I was crushing it at work during this period of workaholism. Like I said, I was barely getting by, but I was putting a lot of hours into keeping myself busy so as not to think about the trauma. And I was definitely burnt out. As it started to become more and more apparent that I was burning myself out, the solution also started to become more apparent that I was not going to get through this by making myself more busy. The answer was actually to go the other way and make myself dramatically less busy. And that is why I decided to take the sabbatical. When it comes to the question of whether you should take a sabbatical or not, I don't think there is an objective answer to that question, and I definitely don't think that's a question that I am able to answer for you. I think this is very much a process where you have to feel it out, and only you can decide if you need a sabbatical, and only you can decide whether a sabbatical is right for you. And the first question I think a lot of people are inclined to ask when considering the idea is, can I afford a sabbatical? And that is an important question, and I'll get to that in the next chapter. But really, the first question I think people should ask themselves is, do I need a sabbatical? And there are a lot of reasons why somebody might take a sabbatical. Like me, you might be burnt out. There might be some personal circumstance that you should prioritize over your career right now. Or you might be considering a career shift, which is also part of the reason why I took a sabbatical. And when contemplating that question, you might realize that you do not need one, or that you need one and your circumstances do not allow you to take one right now. And both of those are completely understandable. And then the other answer you come to might be that you don't need a sabbatical, but you do want one. And that's also perfectly reasonable too. So if we take the question of, do I need a sabbatical? The frame that I like to look at this through is there something more important than my career that I should be prioritizing right now? And you'll notice that I didn't say something more desirable than my career. I said more important. And I think it's important for people to remember that a sabbatical is not a vacation, at least not in the traditional sense. The focus isn't on fun or recreation. That definitely can be a part of it and most likely will be a part of it. But really, you are creating space so that you have time to reflect on your mental health, or maybe you're contemplating a big life shift, either a change in career or a big geographical move. And for a lot of people, that idea is very scary. And definitely in my case, it is very easy to operate in a place of denial of this question for a very long time, because it's the easier, safer thing to do. And I'm definitely not saying that from a place of judgment. I did this myself for many, many years, almost 2 decades. And I can definitely say that personally, I paid the price for not answering that question of, is there something more important than my career right now that I should be focusing on? And I did that for almost 2 decades, and it took a very heavy toll, definitely emotionally, but also in many other areas of my life. So I think thinking about this question in service of your life as a whole, and not just in terms of taking a break from your career, is very important. As it became more and more obvious that the answer was yes to the question of, do I need a sabbatical? The next logical question was, how do I go about taking a sabbatical? And I think when thinking about a sabbatical, there are 2 ways to think about it. One is taking a temporary break from your job, and the other is leaving your job to take a break from your career. And in the case of the former, your employer might be on board with the idea. Some employers even have programs that mandate sabbaticals after a certain number of years. But if they are not you might want to consider resigning from your existing job with the goal of finding a new job later. And I definitely don't want to trivialize that or minimize that, especially not in the current economic climate with layoffs and hiring freezes. That is obviously a very scary prospect to leave your current job and not have another one lined up for a lot of people. But I am not suggesting that you make this decision at the spur of the moment. I think there is a lot of thinking and strategizing and planning that has to go into actually resigning from your job. But I think it is important to think about upfront how you will actually go about taking the sabbatical. And I think an additional consideration here is asking yourself, do I want to work for an employer who doesn't support my mental health? Or if you're planning to leave your job anyway, do you want to continue working in a job that you do not like when your ultimate goal is to switch maybe companies or switch careers? And would it be more beneficial for you to quit your job sooner rather than later? And it might not be the right decision to leave your job right now. And again, I think that's totally reasonable and totally understandable. No matter which option you are thinking of choosing, whether it is a temporary leave of absence from your current employer or a more permanent resignation, I think the next logical question for most people is, how will I be able to live with no income? And again, this is a very important question. I feel very fortunate that I was in a financial position where I was able to consider taking a full year sabbatical. And I realized that not everybody can do that, but there were some things that I was able to put in place over the last couple of years that have allowed me to do this. If we go all the way back to 2014, I had just moved to the US after taking a transfer with Microsoft of my job in Ireland to a new job in Washington State. And this was a very well-paid, comfortable job. And because of the massive discrepancy between Ireland and the US in terms of taxes and cost of living and take-home pay, I was making significantly more money than I had been just a couple of months prior. And I did not have any grasp of financial literacy at the time. And I was living paycheck to paycheck. Again, going back to the idea of process addictions, one of the other things that I struggled with over the last couple of years was spending addiction. And I was blowing through my paycheck every single month. I was spending my money on all sorts of things that I did not need and also ran up a stupid amount of credit card debt. And I also really did not like my job. And it seemed like a lot of the people I worked with also did not really enjoy their job that much. But it was very comfortable and it was very well paid. And a lot of people made that trade-off of taking the comfortable, secure choice and not really prioritizing job satisfaction. And again, this does not come from a place of judgment, but very much this was not the situation for me. I really wanted a more rewarding career path and not to do things so much for the money. But then also, on the flip side of that, I had become accustomed to this certain lifestyle and found myself in a position where I had to keep working this job to support that lifestyle. And I really didn't like that. I didn't like being beholden to a job that I did not enjoy. And so I started to take steps to become financially literate so that I could start becoming more financially independent, living more within my needs, and start to have more financial flexibility in terms of what I wanted to do with my life. And again, I use the phrase financial flexibility instead of financial freedom because I mean, even today, I have not achieved financial freedom. And I think that is a long-term goal for most people. It is not something that is achievable in the very short term. So I think using the term financial flexibility is a lot more accessible for people in a maybe 1 to 5 year time frame. There are many different tools and resources out there to teach you financial literacy. And some are good, some are not so good. The one that I would recommend to most people who are brand new to financial literacy is the blog Mr. Money Mustache, which is mrmoneymustache.com. And I would recommend checking out the link on the front page to the recommended articles. I think everything in there will give you a good foundation for becoming financially literate and financially flexible. When it comes to achieving financial flexibility, it's really just a 3-step process. And I can give you a very quick overview of what those 3 steps are. And the first one is to cut down on all non-necessary expenditure in your life. So usually the best way to do this is to have an idea of all of the expenditure on any given month. And there are a number of tools that give you insights and tracking into this. The one that I have really enjoyed over the last couple of years is the website mint.com. And it really shows you where your money is going. It categorizes all of the transactions and it integrates with all of your credit cards and stuff like that. And as you start to look into your monthly expenditure, you look for ways that you can reduce that. So that might mean cutting out an expensive TV package that you pay for every month. It might mean switching to a cheaper phone service, eating out less, trading in your car for something more economical, maybe moving to a different area where your rent is cheaper. You're just looking for ways to bring your expenditure number down so that you have more money that you can put into savings. And the idea there is that a good defense is the best offense. When it comes to comparing reducing your expenditure with increasing your income, it is a lot easier to cut expenditure than it is to increase income. And it is usually a change that most people can make overnight, whereas increasing income, it can be relatively difficult depending on which industry you're in, but it's also a much longer term process. Like usually that can take several weeks to months to increase your income. So you want to take the step of reducing your expenditure first so that you can start saving immediately. And then step number 2 would be building a safety net. So this is essentially your emergency fund. And you do this by figuring out what is the minimum monthly expenditure that you have on any given month. So if you were to take a month where you are not making a major purchase or not going on vacation or some unusual expenditure, if you were to add up all of your rent, food, utilities, all that kind of stuff, what is the minimum number that you would need to spend in any given month to survive? And then you figure out, if I were unable to work for a certain amount of time, be it 1 month, 3 months, something like that, what is the amount of runway that I would need to have peace of mind and not worry about having money in the bank to pay my bills? And this is a matter of personal preference. For some people, they're not worried about only having 1 month of savings in the bank. For some people, they're not worried about having 12 months of savings. And really, only you can answer that question of how long could I be unemployed and not worry about money? And then when you have the answer to that question, you multiply those 2 numbers, your minimum monthly expenditure and the number of months of runway that you need, and that is your safety net figure. That is the amount of money that you should have in your emergency fund. And as you cut your expenditure, that is, if you have not already hit that figure in savings, that is the first financial goal that you are trying to achieve, is saving towards that number. And as you start to put more money away each month because you have reduced your expenditure, you should be putting that in some sort of safe investment vehicle. So that would be something like a high yield savings account that is government insured, or a bond fund, something that does not have a lot of risk involved. And then as you are done with that goal and you have hit that number, this is not your sabbatical fund, although potentially it could be used for that in the future. The next step is really where your sabbatical fund goes. What you want to do after you have hit the number for your emergency fund is continue saving and save as much money as you can from the leftover income after you have paid your bills and all of that stuff. Put the remainder into a higher risk, higher return vehicle. So for most people, that would be a stock index fund. I do not recommend higher risk or more speculative vehicles like crypto or something like that. I think taking a proven long-term option like an S&P 500 index fund is going to be the right choice for the vast majority of people. And the other thing I will say is that this process will not be fast and it will not be fun. But again, try not to think of it in terms of this is something that you're going to accomplish in the next month. Think of it as a process that is in service of a much longer term goal. And depending on your situation, this could be something that you achieve in 3 months. It could be something that you achieve in a year. It could be 3 years, 5 years. For me, it was a much longer process for two reasons. The first is that I struggled to find the discipline to reduce my spending. And then the second is that I didn't have a particular goal in mind when I started this process. I really just wanted to get out of debt and had not really considered taking a sabbatical yet. But it was beneficial down the road when I had started to save money and be more financially responsible, that it allowed me this flexibility to take the sabbatical when I wanted to. I think once you have addressed those two questions, the first one being, does my employer support me taking a sabbatical? And the second being, am I able to afford taking a sabbatical for as long as I want to? The next question that will be at the forefront of many people's minds is, what will I actually do on my sabbatical? And I struggled with this one for a while when I started mine. It was actually very scary for me to stop working. I didn't realize it at the time, but I had a lot of my identity tied up in this idea of being successful and being successful in my career. For me, those two things were synonymous, whereas now I don't really feel the same way. I think it is possible to be successful in life without being successful in career. But when I decided to stop working and both of these ideas were taken away from me, even though it was only temporary, it was very challenging for me. And I scrambled to feel like I was enough and that I had self-worth because, again, I was not doing any sort of work to advance my career. And so how I responded to that was to jam-pack my schedule with busyness again. And people would ask me, especially in the first 6 weeks of the sabbatical, how I was spending my time. And I would tell them like, oh, I'm working out 6 days a week. I'm reading a bunch of books. I have all this travel planned. I'm researching this podcast, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it was just a cover of keeping myself busy to distract myself from what was right in front of my face. And I think definitely this part is one that people should pay more attention to and have more intentionality around in terms of goal setting for the sabbatical and how you will actually spend that time. And I think in my particular case, just giving myself time off and time to not do anything should have been more apparent up front, but I did not front load that planning or that structure to really set myself up for success. And that is something that I wish I had done differently before I started the sabbatical. Again, in my particular case, the point of the sabbatical was not to be busy or to prove to people that I have self-worth even though I don't have a job. The point was to use the sabbatical as the word is intended, which is a Sabbath or a time of rest. I needed to dedicate some time to allow those very complicated emotions that have been living under the surface for a very long time to come up. And even now, 8 months in, almost 9 months in, this is an ongoing process. And it still surprises me that as I create more space for this stuff to show itself, all it took was for me to not do anything. And if you are familiar at all with meditation, you will be somewhat familiar with this idea. But definitely in my case, this is not something that came naturally to me. So, how actually have I spent the last 8 months on my sabbatical? And again, not to belabor the point, but a lot of the early part of this process was just becoming comfortable with the idea of not being busy and giving myself permission to not do anything. And as I gave myself more time to breathe and more time off, the focus of the sabbatical shifted to just being healthy and doing the things that were conducive to my own health, be it physical or mental. And when it comes to focusing on my physical health, I still work out a lot. I was already relatively physically healthy before the sabbatical started, but now I do CrossFit. I go to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. I paddleboard. I cycle. And then this has done wonders for my mental health. And in addition to that, I see a therapist every week. I am part of a survivors group and a men's group. I journal, I meditate, I spend time in nature, and I also launched this podcast, obviously, which has been a amazing resource for my mental health and has been really helpful in combating that feeling of isolation from my trauma, and then also fostering a sense of support and community by talking to so many people about their own experiences with trauma. I really just cannot stress enough how beneficial it has been to take this time off and to give myself permission to take a break. And so, if taking a sabbatical is something that you are considering, I would really encourage you to move it up your list of priorities and really spend some time pondering the questions that I have raised during this podcast episode. If you are somebody who has been working for a very long time, or you are just feeling burnt out or feeling like you need time to ponder a major life decision, a sabbatical could be incredibly beneficial for you, both for your mental health and just your overall sense of happiness. And I hope this episode has been helpful for you in informing you of the ways that you are able to take a sabbatical and also why you might take a sabbatical. And if you have any questions or would like to follow up with me about anything that I have discussed during this podcast, please do email me at david@tisfortrauma.com, and I will try my best to answer that. Thanks for listening, guys. Bye-bye.